Hey, warm and friendly hello, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the Houston Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to have a nice two-part chat today with Blake Lovell, who does great work over at Southeastern16. We're going to be chatting with him about how to take a look at the landscape of the conference, as they're one of the few power conferences / bigger conferences that still plays 18 regular season games in terms of conference play. A lot of these other conferences have went to 20 games, so we'll talk about some of the advantages that lends to the SEC. We're also going to be diving in on how he evaluates these scrimmage / exhibition results, how much / little stock he puts into those. We're also going to be talking about some of these coaches in year number 2 and year number 3 and their expectations both in the SEC and overall, as we get spoiled by some of these coaches that in year number 1. I keep bringing it up. TJ Otzelberger over at Iowa State, taking a team that won 2 games and taking them to winning 2 games in the NCAA tournament the next year. So I do have to bring that up as well. And then I know that there's a few Big Ten teams that are popping up on his radar as well. So we're going to have a great chat with him, and just really have not been getting a lot of college basketball news in. We did see Utah State accept a invitation to the Pac-12, but if I'm calling it what it is for preparing for the upcoming 2024-25 season, that doesn't do a lot for us. Lots of hoopla if you're a fan of college sports in general, and seems like we are going to be getting a reincarnation of the Pac-12 within the next few years, although it might not have 12 teams. It might be the Pac-8, might be the Pac-10, which I believe it was at one point the Pac-8 and the Pac-10, so that's very nice to see. But in terms of college basketball this season, lots of the news, the haze in the barn, and now we're awaiting these teams to start suiting it up in terms of these scrimmages, what have you, so we're turning our attention there, and I just want to give you guys everything that I can to get you set for the upcoming college basketball season, because we are now less than 6 weeks away from the start of the season, down to just 4 conference previews remaining as well. So if I did all 4 conference previews this week, that would lead to probably a pretty boring final 5 weeks leading up to the start of the college basketball season. But let me know what you want to hear on this podcast. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you, for this fine show, you've got one of 2 ways to be offer those in. First one is my Twitter /X timeline at Jaden_D1. Keep in mind, LRCM, maybe does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and we're always firing all cylinders when this man is bored, as it is Blake Lovell of Southeastern16. He also does great work over at the Clutch Point Sports app, and he is a man that joins me every single year for my SEC conference preview as well. I plan on that being the case in the next few weeks as well. You're able to follow him on Twitter /X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell, and Blake, it is always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for always having me on, Greg.
Absolutely, Blake. We've got ourselves a new look SEC, as you guys had to change your name from Southeastern 14 to Southeastern 16, and the schedule did recently get released. Was there any sort of takeaways that you had from it in terms of just the way that things shake out in terms of travel? Because I feel like out of everything that we've seen this offseason, at the very least for the Southeastern Conference, you're not going to have some of these teams, unlike what we're going to be seeing in the Big Ten with like USC having to travel to like Rutgers and everything like that. You're going to be avoiding those 1,000 plus mile road trips, which I think is going to be very beneficial for some of these teams trying to pick up road wins.
Yeah, I mean, I think the SEC, unlike, as you said, some other conferences, have done a pretty good job of staying with the geography theme instead of trying to, go across country to pick up teams and all that. And yeah, certainly, Texas and Oklahoma, not much of a trip, especially for a team like Texas or LSU and teams like that. So, when you talk about the schedule, we did talk to Garth Glissman, who's the associate commissioner for SEC basketball. And, he made it very clear that this was one where, how they built their schedule this year, they were really trying to make some of those destination type games where, sometimes we're like, well, you may hear conferences say, well, the schedule is completely random and those kind of things. And sure, it is to a degree, but at the same time, you want to get some of those bigger games kind of spotlighted. And as we talked about this summer, Greg, it is one of those scenarios where you've got some of those huge storylines, whether it's Cal taking Arkansas into Rupp Arena and doing it now in between the championship games in the NFL and the Super Bowl, which is smart for the SEC because that's kind of, a Super Bowl type game to have that on a weekend where there is no NFL going on between those two big weekends. And then, you've got a Texas and Texas A&M starting off the conference slate. Like, I think that is an exciting game because, that's a game you've been waiting to see. in terms of in that setting in College Station. And so I think a lot of those types of things are certainly built into the schedule. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's one where you kind of continue to look at the landscape in college athletics and in college basketball in particular. And, the thing maybe we're talking about moving forward after this season is, is the SEC going to eventually expand that schedule like many other power conferences into doing a 20-game conference slate? So, yeah, it sets up pretty nicely and should be plenty of good games. So.
And how beneficial do you think that it is that the conference schedule is a little bit thinner as well? Because I've noticed that teams like Alabama is certainly kings of this, but there's a lot of teams in the SEC that they're willing to take some of these non-conference games that it feels like teams in other conferences will not. Like every single year, there's one or two ACC teams that wins like 22 plus games, but they get left off because their non-conference strength of schedule was like 300th. And the SEC has teams that really avoid that, sans maybe like one or two teams that just are expected to do a big giant nothing burger year in and year out.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, that is something we talked about with him too, for him being someone that is in charge of the schedule and discuss, the value of those non-conference games. Like you said, if you look at the schedule that Alabama consistently puts together in terms of, the strength of schedule, they're always near the top. You look at Auburn's schedule this year. I mean, it is a brutal schedule for Auburn in the non-conference slate, but we've seen it pay off. Or like you said, maybe there's teams that come into, an NCAA tournament where you're looking at it and saying, all right, well, that's a team that sure they've got, this or that, but they've only got 21 wins or 22 wins, but it's the value of the wins more than anything. It's how have you been tested? And we saw Alabama make that run last year. We've seen other SEC teams do it in the past. So I think it is something where I would not necessarily want that to go away and having some of those tougher out of conference type games, because I think we've seen the value of it, obviously in the SEC, but certainly you can see it elsewhere in other conferences and certain teams as well. But I just think that's too valuable still than to have to just add a couple more conference games in there. But I think it also depends on what your goal is. And if the NCAA tournament expands, then you certainly have to look at those kind of things and wonder if you're putting yourself, at a disadvantage in any way if you don't add a couple of extra ones just to build up, resumes and strength of schedules and those types of things. But I think, at least at this point, and we've talked about this over the years, Greg, the SEC way further than where it was, let's say, 10 years ago, where you just had so many non-conference games where the schedule was they're going to be favored by 40 points against about 9 of their 12 teams out of conference. You just don't see that anymore. There's a lot more competitive matchups, a lot more competitive scheduling. And I think, as we said, that certainly helped some of these teams kind of revamp their program and make deep runs in March.
Yep, absolutely. And I still remember my last year out there in SEC country out there in Nashville, Tennessee. That was the year that Vanderbilt was in the first 4 against Wichita State. And the SEC that year got 3 teams in the NCAA tournament. Don't think that that's going to be happening anytime soon. They should be able to get many more teams than that. As a man that is always in the fold for us, that would be our good friend Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern16, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and we are getting closer and closer to the start of the season, which means that we are nearing these exhibition games. We're nearing the anti-air quotes here, secret scrimmages, which, well, the results always get out, so I don't know how much of a secret they are anymore. But what do you take from some of these results and some of these exhibitions, these scrimmages? Because there are a lot of fans that are going to be very, very thirsty for college basketball. Any sort of a taste that they're able to get of their team out there on the court, it's either the greatest or the worst thing that they've ever seen based on how that exhibition/scrimmage goes. And typically, I just find that it's great for the fans, but at the same time, the results, in my opinion, do get quite a bit overblown.
Yeah, I mean, we would never overreact to anything, would we, Greg?
That doesn't happen in sports talk at all. I mean, everyone sings nice and just in line. We're not embracing debate at all.
No, we would never do such a thing. But yeah, I mean, it is, human nature. We like to do that because we've been waiting for so long. I think, as we've talked about too, probably, I look at these things and know, having talked to coaches, every coach's goal is going to be different when it comes to these scrimmages. And you may have 2 teams that are playing each other, or again, exhibition games and such. Like, you may have 2 teams playing each other where they're set out to achieve completely different things. And sure, anybody wants to win and have the better team anytime you're playing on the court. That's just the nature of competition. We know how highly competitive it is for college basketball. Like, you always want to win. But at the same time, the coaches are going into this, again, with different objectives. There's certain things they want to see from their team. There's certain rotations that they've been thinking about all summer that are keeping them up at night. And they're like, I want to see how this looks against, another set of 5. And I just think that is kind of where you are with these. And, remember last year, I know there was lots of different results. And the one that just stands out to me, right, was remember that Arkansas-Purdue game last year, the exhibition game. We came out of that saying, my goodness, Arkansas is going to be fantastic, right? You're thinking, okay, do we reset our expectations on Purdue or anything like that? I don't know. And again, we kind of saw the season played out for both teams. That's a unique scenario because that had kind of been the outlier for Eric Musselman's teams at Arkansas in terms of struggling the way they did. But that just kind of shows you that I think that you just cannot read into these things all the time. You can certainly have a pretty good feel of what your roster rotation is going to look like. You can see certain things. If your team comes out and goes 2 of 28 from 3 or something, you might say, all right, well, even though it's an exhibition game, I might want to be a little concerned about our outside shooting. But at the same time, again, everybody's, tweaking rotations and trying to figure out what's going to be best and all that. And everybody's going to get an opportunity kind of prove themselves in those kind of scrimmages and exhibitions. So, no, I don't usually read too much into it. But again, I don't blame anyone that does because this is what we've been waiting on. We're tired of hearing about guys practicing against each other. We just want to see teams play other teams, even if it's a game that doesn't really mean much.
Yeah, absolutely. And the exhibitions, the charities, typically they always go to nice causes as well. So that's always a good thing that comes about from these as well. And I do feel like this is a good stopping point for part number 1. And then in part number 2, we'll talk a little bit more about the motivation of some of these teams that have a whole bunch of transfers that are going to be coming in, them being able to get their work in as opposed to the teams that are a little bit more tried and true. They have a whole bunch of starters coming back. I know that he's also going to be mentioning the Big Ten a little bit, how to take a look at that landscape, some of the teams that he's feeling a little bit bullish on as well. So we've got a great part number 2 of this chat with Blake coming up on the flip side right here on Coach Go Soups with myself, Trey Peters, and now a part of the Decent Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Soups with myself, Greg Peters, and now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Great to be rejoined by Blake Lovell, who does great work over at Clutch Point Sports, the app and the website, along with Southeastern16. You're able to follow him on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell, and we were just leaving off by talking about some of the teams that we are taking a look at for the upcoming college basketball season, how for them some of these scrimmages, the exhibitions, they don't mean so much. But how about if we take a look at the teams that have many more moving parts in terms of a new coach and in terms of a lot of transfers? I do think that it is interesting just in terms of motivation for these teams as well, because I look at a team like Vanderbilt where everything is brand spanking new. You bring in a new coach, you bring in a whole bunch of transfers, and what that rotation is going to be looking like, what the starters are going to be looking like, very much in question. Whereas with Alabama, I feel like it's a little bit more, okay, we know what we can expect out of this team as well. How much you just take a look at the offseason and the lead up in terms of these practices, the exhibitions for a team like Vanderbilt differently than these teams that are a little bit more tried and true?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. I think can extend beyond Vanderbilt where there are other teams, not just in the SEC, but nationally where, you look at some teams, you're like, that's a completely new team, right? It's like it's a new team. How do you figure out exactly what you have? Well, you don't really know until you're able to get out and do that. And that's where those kind of games and results can mean a bit more, I think, for teams like that, because you are looking at it and saying, all right, this is Mark Byington's first season. As we know, anytime you get a job, the clock starts ticking, right? And it's like, sure, coaches aren't going to, just completely come out and feel like that all the pressure's on right away. But that's kind of how it works in this era, because we've seen so many teams be able to flip their fortunes in one off season because you can build an entirely different team each year now. And so I think that is, a lot more intriguing when you look at teams like that, where you have coaching changes and you're trying to figure out how all these pieces are going to get to fit together. Because remember, there was a time where it's like you felt like the only teams that we were talking about in this manner used to be, Kentucky to the strongest extent, because every year it was Cal would have, a dozen freshmen. You're like, all right, well, all those guys are leaving, maybe all but 2. And so we had to figure out, well, how's the chemistry going to come together? That was the question we always had for Cal's earlier teams in Kentucky, because he was like the outlier in terms of how he was building his roster. Now, where you have so many of these, because like you said, you have an Alabama bringing guys back, you got Auburn bringing all these guys back, and so forth. These are teams we've already seen that really, the chemistry's there. They mesh together very well. And it's really just seeing how a couple of those new pieces fit into the mix. But elsewhere, it's trying to see what Vanderbilt's going to look like. What does a team like Missouri look like, who has certainly something to prove after going 0 for last year, but may have a top half roster in terms of talent this season. Teams like that. So, yeah, it is a lot more exciting And you probably can read a little bit more into some of the newer teams that are really, have a lot of new faces and see how the chemistry works on that.
Yep, and that is going to be so much fun and so much pain of this offseason as well, trying to figure out how these teams are going to maneuver, as we do have our good friend Blake Lovell, who does great work over at Southeastern 16, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And as we know, a few new coaches within the conference. It's going to be different for Arkansas along with Kentucky, though with Arkansas, obviously, you do have quite a few guys that follow John Calipari on over from Kentucky, so you have a few pieces there we were talking about with Mark Byington over at Vanderbilt. But how do you take a look at some of these year 2 and year 3 coaches as well? Because I think that that's where the intrigue comes in, because I do think that there have become some, shall we say, irrational expectations for coaches in season number 1, where they just get a little bit underrated going into season number 2, season number 3, or they get a little bit hyped up as well, a little bit too much after what we saw with Missouri, for instance, that big year number 1, disappointment in year number 2. How do you take a look at these guys that are trying to be able to find their bearings in year 2 and year 3? Because I think that those are some of the bigger question marks that we find as well, because they just go a little bit less talked about than these first year coaches. But as we know, they're trying to establish their culture still as well.
Missouri is a great example because, if you look at Missouri and South Carolina, they were just on the opposite ends in terms of all of a sudden one team comes out of nowhere in the 22-23 season, and that's Missouri. No one thought they would be as good as they were. They make a run to the second round of the tournament. Probably, seeding-wise, felt like they should have been in the Sweet 16 since they played Princeton in the second round, but we know Princeton got hot, made that run. But then, you look at South Carolina, where it was the opposite for them. They didn't have an over season like Missouri did last year, but that first year for Lamont Paris, it was one where they were certainly struggling. Yeah, they had the signature win. I think they went in and won at Kentucky, but they were getting beat, 40 plus here, 40 plus there. They were losing some double digit games. I think Tennessee was a team that really had their number. A&M, I think, beat them by 40 something that year. But then last year, we all basically pick them, Greg, at the bottom of the conference. And what do? They win 26 games. They're right there going to the final, weekend of the regular season with a chance to win the league. And so I think that just shows you the toughness of this conference. And that's what we talked about, as this roster, coaching roster that is, has just continued to be stacked year after year with all of these accomplished coaches. And so, yeah, when you look at guys like that, we've talked a lot about Todd Golden at Florida. That first year was a disappointment because they go 16-17, and you felt like, maybe with the roster they had, they should have been a little bit better. But last year they took a big step forward. This year, I think they've got a chance to be right on par with where they were last year, if not better, because they have one of the best players in the conference in Walter Clayton. So I think, it is going to be interesting to see how some of these coaches kind of continue to develop their programs, because even like a Matt McMahon, who felt like he was just, in a really tough spot after year 1, only winning 2 regular season games in the SEC, at LSU, all of a sudden he comes back and wins 9 conference games last year. So I think it is something where we always say, Greg, somebody's got to finish 1 through 16. The unfortunate part is somebody is going to finish 16, and you just kind of hope that you're not the team that is there on a regular basis. But as we've seen, it's kind of flip-flop in recent years, where some of the teams that have been really bad all of a sudden pop up the next year and they're really good. And then it's kind of the reverse sometimes in the other way. So, yeah, that's just the strength of this league. And there is kind of, no mercy when it comes to having that margin for error that could send you from feeling like you're a top 5 team in the league to all of a sudden feeling like your team is in the bottom 4.
We always hear about going from worst to first in divisions in the NFL. A lot of people don't think about it too much in college basketball, but we do see it more often than not. Like Southern Miss a few years ago in the Sun Belt was such a good example of a team that was able to catch on fire, and that was fun to be able to take a look at. And I always have to ask you about this because, Blake, you cover a little bit of everything. You do so also well. Is there a team or two that you've been looking at over the last few weeks that is starting to catch your eye and you're starting to feel a little bit more bullish about them?
It's interesting because you brought this up at the start, and this was kind of on my mind as I go through and look at all these conferences coming into the season. This week has kind of been Big Ten theme for me. Like, I've really looked at the Big Ten because obviously you're going to have some non-conference games as someone who primarily covers the SEC, but you're going to have some of those games against Big Ten teams. And I think what is most fascinating is, again, what you brought up at the beginning as we were talking about different conferences and how they built those conferences. And of course, that is the addition of teams like UCLA and Oregon and USC and all these teams kind of coming into the Big Ten. And I think that's where, for me, looking at teams like UCLA and USC, and obviously for the travel reasons that we've discussed, it's fascinating for that reason alone. But you do have kind of a scenario where you look at these 2 coaches, right? And we know these are 2 coaches in terms of building programs. We know what they're capable of. And I think, it's going to be interesting for Mick Cronin as you look at this team. They've got some really good guard play on that team there. And I think I'm curious to see how UCLA kind of steps in here, knowing that there are probably going to be some teams, picked in front of them without question in this conference. But I think, how do they adapt? And how do you adapt to what we know is a league like the Big Ten, where we always say, Greg, like sometimes people think we overplay it in terms of, there's different playing styles in different leagues, but it is true. And you see how some of these teams play. And I think it's how do you adjust to that for an entire, regular season as you go through the slate. And then, of course, for Eric Musselman, who we talked about coming over from Arkansas now to USC, I think it's something else where Muss, as we've always mentioned, is the king of the transfer portal, went out, put together a really talented roster. Do I think that they're going to be picked, in the top 5 of that league by any means? Probably not, because you're going to look at teams, of course, like Indiana and Illinois, Purdue, and so forth. I don't think they're going to be picked there, but I do think it's at least interesting to look at the roster he's built. And I think Eric Musselman is going to have something to prove, right? Coming off of just what was a brutal season at Arkansas, where no one expected them to have the season they had. He goes and takes the USC job. And I think now, when you kind of look at the roster he's built, this is a team that's probably flying a little bit under the radar. And I feel like they're going to have, an opportunity to come out with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder and really see if they can also adapt pretty well to the Big Ten.
Yep, and it's going to be so interesting to see how those teams in a new conference are going to be able to adapt. We're going to be getting that in the SEC with Texas and Oklahoma. So far, so good for Texas on the football front. We'll see how the basketball front is able to go. All the added travel, as we know, the Big Ten is always kings of home court advantage as well. That's going to be interesting to take a look at as well. So glad that you bring them up. And Blake, you're doing an amazing job getting set for this upcoming college basketball season. You do such great work following this sport all 12 months out of the year. So let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you, and how people are able to follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, I always appreciate it, Greg. Like I said, you can check out all of our SEC stuff, basketball and so forth over at Southeastern16 on YouTube. You can find us there. And everything else college basketball related. I'm on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell.
Absolutely. And Blake, he does such a good job every single time he joins the show of lending such great insights. Always great to get him aboard. And sooner rather than later, we're going to be having that SEC preview. Hopefully we can get Blake aboard for that, as that has become a tradition on this podcast, unlike any other as well. So a big thanks to Blake for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we have fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Janet_D1. Keep in mind, Lord ZM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please just send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. We're down to just 4 conference previews, by the way. We're looking at the Big 12, the Big East, the Big 10, and then the SEC, which Blake, I'm sure that he is going to be along with me for that one as well. He joins me every year for that one, so we'll plan that out for the next few weeks, and we'll plan on another great podcast for you tomorrow. Thank you so much for tuning in.